The war that burned the White House. In 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain, and Great Britain was like, sorry, who are you again? Because Britain was already busy fighting Napoleon. Napoleon was trying to dominate Europe. Britain was trying to stop him. France and Britain were fighting a giant world war, and America was stuck in the middle, trying to trade with both sides without getting bullied by either side. That did not go well. The British Navy was stopping American ships. The French were causing problems too. American merchants were angry. American sailors were angry. American politicians were angry. And President James Madison was trying to decide how angry a country has to be before it starts a war it is not ready for. The biggest problem was impressment. That is when the British Navy stopped ships and forced sailors into British service. Britain said, "We are only taking British deserters." America said, "Some of those men are Americans."
Britain said, "They look British enough." America said, "That is not how citizenship works." Britain had a huge navy. Huge navies need huge numbers of sailors, and when you are fighting Napoleon, you do not have time to be polite about paperwork. So British ships stopped American ships, searched them, and sometimes took sailors. To Americans, this felt like a direct insult, because the United States had already fought one war to stop being pushed around by Britain. Now Britain was back at sea saying, "Nice independence you have there. Anyway, we need this sailor." Imagine moving out of your parents' house, getting your own place, paying your own bills, and then your old landlord walks in and takes your chair. That is my chair. It used to be British. It was made in Pennsylvania. Close enough. That is not a perfect comparison, but it is close enough for politics. There was another problem too, trade. Britain and France were at war, so each side tried to stop neutral countries from trading with the other. America wanted to trade with Europe. Britain said, "Not with France." France said, "Not with Britain." America said, "Can we please sell flour without joining your giant European argument?" Europe said, "No." So America tried a new idea. What if America stopped trading with everyone? This was called the Embargo Act. The goal was to punish Britain and France by refusing to sell them American goods. Which sounds clever until you remember that American merchants also needed to sell American goods. So the plan was basically, we will hurt Britain by punching ourselves in the face. Is Britain hurt? No. Are we hurt? Very. The embargo was unpopular. Merchants hated it. Smugglers loved it. New England complained loudly. And Britain and France did not immediately fall to the ground saying, "Oh no, where is our American flour?" So America tried other trade restrictions. Those also did not solve the problem. By 1812, many Americans felt that talking had failed, and in Congress, a group of young politicians called war hawks wanted action. They were called war hawks because young men who think fighting Britain will solve everything was too long for a nickname. The war hawks believed Britain was insulting American honor. They believed Britain was encouraging native resistance on the frontier, and some of them believed the United States could conquer Canada. Canada was British territory, and many Americans looked at Canada and thought, what if that was ours? This is one of the most dangerous sentences in history. What if that was ours? It usually means someone is about to make maps worse. The war hawks thought invading Canada might be easy. Some believed Canadians would welcome the Americans. Because nothing says this will be easy like assuming the people you invade will be excited. Hello, Canada. We are here to liberate you from Britain. Did we ask for that? No, but we brought flags. At the same time, many Americans on the frontier were angry about native resistance. Native nations were trying to protect their lands from American expansion, and some Americans blamed Britain for helping them. There was some truth to British support, but there was also a much bigger truth. Native peoples did not need Britain to explain why they should worry about American settlers moving west. They could see that for themselves. The United States was growing. Settlers were pushing into new lands. Treaties were being made, broken, pressured, or misunderstood, and native nations were being squeezed. One of the most important native leaders was Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader who tried to build a confederation to resist American expansion. Tecumseh understood something very clearly. If each native nation stood alone, the United States could deal with them one by one. But if they stood together, maybe they had a chance. So while Washington talked about honor, sailors, and trade, the Western frontier had its own war already building. This is why the War of 1812 is not just one simple war. It is America versus Britain. It is America trying to invade Canada. It is Britain trying to protect Canada while fighting Napoleon. It is native nations fighting for their future. It is merchants wanting trade. It is farmers wanting markets. It is politicians wanting honor. It is also a lot of people being very confident right before things go badly. For native nations, the stakes were enormous. If Britain won, maybe American expansion could be slowed. If America won, settlers would keep pushing west. If both sides made peace without protecting native lands, native peoples could be left alone against a growing United States. And that is mostly what happened. This is one reason the Treaty of Ghent feels so strange. The United States and Britain could agree to restore borders, but native nations were not restored to the position they had before the war. Their losses were not simply erased. The map might look unchanged between America and Britain, but on the ground, power had shifted. That is why nothing changed is not really true. Nothing changed if you only look at the border between the United States and Canada. Many things changed if you look at who could resist American expansion afterward. In June 1812, President Madison asked Congress for war. Congress agreed. The vote was not unanimous, not even close. Many Federalists opposed the war. New England especially hated it. New England depended on trade, and war with Britain was bad for trade. So America declared war while parts of America were saying, "Please do not include us in this group project." That is not usually how you start a confident war. But the war began anyway. Now America had to fight Great Britain, the world's strongest naval power. While America had a small army, a small navy, limited money, divided politics, and a plan that mostly involved saying, Canada will probably be easy. Canada was not easy. The United States planned several invasions, and the first year of the war became a masterclass in overconfidence. One American army was led by General William Hull. Hull crossed from Detroit into Canada. At first, this looked like the beginning of an invasion. Then it became the beginning of a problem. British forces and native allies under Tecumseh pressured Hull. The British commander Isaac Brock made his force look stronger than it really was. Tecumseh's warriors moved in ways that made their numbers seem larger. Hull became nervous. Then he surrendered Detroit. Without a major battle, America had declared war, invaded Canada, and then handed over Detroit. That is not ideal. The British were probably like, "Thank you for visiting Canada. Please leave your fort on the way out." Hull's surrender shocked Americans. It embarrassed the government. It made the war look foolish almost immediately, and it showed that Canada was not just going to fall over because Congress had confidence. Other American invasions also failed. One army tried to cross the Niagara River. That also went badly. At Queenston Heights, American forces fought British and Canadian defenders. General Isaac Brock was killed, which was a major loss for the British and Canadians. But the American attack still failed. Some American militia refused to cross into Canada because they believed they were only required to defend their own state, not invade another country. So part of the American plan was, everyone, cross the river. And some soldiers said, "Actually, my contract says no." This is not how Napoleon did things. By the end of 1812, the United States had failed to conquer Canada. The war that some people thought would be quick was already awkward. And that awkwardness mattered. Because the whole idea of invading Canada had been sold as something that might be simple. Some Americans thought Canada was weak. Some thought Canadians would switch sides. Some thought Britain was too busy with Napoleon to defend it properly. But Canada was not just a prize sitting on a shelf. It had British regulars, Canadian militia, native allies, forts, rivers, lakes, bad roads, cold weather, and a very strong interest in not becoming American. This is a useful rule. If your war plan depends on the enemy being happy to be invaded, maybe get a second plan. The failures also damaged American confidence. The war hawks had promised action, but action is not the same as success. Congress could declare war in Washington. Newspapers could print bold speeches. Politicians could talk about honor. But armies still had to march through mud, forests, and snow. And Canada was very good at being made of mud, forests, and snow.
But America did have one place where things went better: the sea. Which is strange because Britain had the world's strongest navy. The Royal Navy was enormous. America's navy was tiny by comparison. If this were a schoolyard fight, Britain had the whole football team and America had 3 kids and a confident hat. But in ship-to-ship combat, some American frigates were very strong. The USS Constitution became famous. In 1812, it defeated HMS Guerriere. During the battle, British cannonballs seemed to bounce off the Constitution's strong wooden sides, so it got the nickname Old Ironsides. Was it actually made of iron? No. Was the nickname awesome? Yes. The Constitution and other American ships won several famous victories. These victories did not give America control of the ocean. Britain still had the bigger navy. Britain still blockaded American ports. Britain still controlled the broader war at sea. But the victories helped American morale, and when your land invasion strategy is mostly failing, morale is very useful. Morale was especially important because the British blockade was painful. American ships could not move freely. Exports fell. Imports became harder to get. Coastal towns worried about raids. Merchants complained. Farmers lost markets. The federal government lost customs revenue, which was a major source of money. So when people talk about the War of 1812, they often remember the dramatic fires and battles. But a lot of the war was slower and less cinematic. Ships stuck in port, prices rising, goods disappearing, insurance becoming expensive, business owners wondering why politicians had chosen war with the country that controlled the ocean. The blockade did not make good paintings, but it made very real problems, and those problems helped explain why so many Americans were tired of the war by 1814. Meanwhile, privateers also became important. Privateers were privately owned ships authorized by the government to attack enemy commerce. Basically, legal pirates with paperwork. Are you a pirate? No, I have a document. That sounds like a pirate with office supplies. American privateers attacked British trade and caused trouble. They did not defeat Britain, but they made the war more annoying for Britain, and annoying Britain was one of America's main wartime achievements. In 1813, the war continued. The United States still wanted Canada. Canada still preferred not to be conquered. In the Great Lakes region, control of water mattered. The lakes were highways. If you controlled the lakes, you could move troops and supplies. If you did not, your army might have a very bad time. On Lake Erie, American commander Oliver Hazard Perry built a fleet. Then he fought a British squadron in September 1813. The battle was fierce. Perry's flagship was badly damaged, so he transferred to another ship and kept fighting. Then the Americans won. Perry sent a message: "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." Which is one of the most dramatic ways in history to say, "Good news, we won." The victory on Lake Erie helped the Americans regain Detroit. Then American forces pursued the British and their native allies into Canada. At the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh was killed. This was a major turning point in the Western theater. Tecumseh's Confederation had been one of the strongest hopes for native resistance against American expansion. His death weakened that resistance badly. So for the United States, the victory helped secure the Northwest. For many Native peoples, it was a disaster. This is one of the reasons the War of 1812 looks different depending on who is telling the story. For Americans, it can look like a war for independence and honor. For Canadians, it can look like a successful defense. For Native nations, it can look like another step toward loss of land and power. Same war, different map, different memory. Down south, another conflict was unfolding: the Creek War. This was connected to the wider War of 1812, but it also had its own causes inside Native politics. A faction known as the Red Sticks fought against American expansion and against other Creeks who wanted accommodation with the United States. Andrew Jackson led American forces and allied Native groups against the Red Sticks. In 1814, Jackson defeated them at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. The result was devastating for the Creek people. The Treaty of Fort Jackson forced the Creeks to give up a huge amount of land. Even some Creeks who had fought alongside Jackson lost land. Because Andrew Jackson was not famous for saying, "Thank you for helping, please keep your territory." This Southern campaign made Jackson famous, and soon he would become even more famous. But first, Washington was about to have a terrible day. In 1814, everything changed. Napoleon was defeated and sent into exile. Britain looked away from Europe and said, "Now, where were we?" America said, "Oh no." With Napoleon temporarily out of the way, Britain could send more troops and ships to North America. The war became much more dangerous for the United States. Britain strengthened its blockade. American ports suffered, trade suffered, the economy suffered, and British forces planned attacks along the American coast. One target was the Chesapeake Bay region. From there, they moved toward Washington, D.C. Now, Washington was the capital, but it was not the giant city we know today. It was smaller, younger, less developed, and not very ready to be attacked. American leaders argued about where the British would go. Some thought they would attack Baltimore. Some thought Washington was not the real target. The British were like, "Actually, we are coming right there." This is a recurring problem in military history. The enemy does not always attack the place you prefer them to attack. On August 24, 1814, American forces tried to stop the British at the Battle of Bladensburg. This battle did not go well for the United States. The American defense was poorly organized. Many troops were militia. Some fought bravely, but the overall line collapsed. The retreat became so embarrassing that people later called it the Bladensburg Races. That is a very rude nickname for your national defense. It means your army did less defending the capital and more competitive running away. After Bladensburg, the road to Washington was open. President Madison had to flee. Government officials fled. Papers and records were moved. And First Lady Dolly Madison helped save important items from the president's house, including the famous portrait of George Washington. Imagine being told, "The British are coming, we need to leave now," and your response is, "Hold on, we are not leaving George." That is commitment to interior decoration and national symbolism. The British entered Washington. Then they burned public buildings, the Capitol, the President's house, government offices, the Library of Congress. The capital of the United States was on fire. This is the moment everyone remembers. The White House burned. Technically, it was not officially called the White House yet, but "the British burned the President's house" does not fit on a thumbnail as well. The burning was partly retaliation. American forces had burned government buildings in York, which is now Toronto, during an earlier attack in Canada. Britain did not forget. Britain said, "You burned our public buildings?" America said, "Technically colonial public buildings." Britain said, "Great, we found yours." The burning of Washington was humiliating. The United States had declared war on Britain, and now British troops were setting fire to its capital. That is a bad look. But here's the twist. Burning Washington did not end the war. It made Americans angry. It turned humiliation into determination. Because if someone burns your capital, you usually do not say, "Fair point, we surrender." You say, "Now this is personal." There was also a strange detail. The British occupation of Washington did not last long. A massive storm hit the city. There was heavy rain. There were strong winds. Some accounts describe a tornado. The storm damaged buildings and scattered British troops. So after the British burned Washington, the weather showed up and said, "My turn." The British left. Washington was damaged and embarrassed, but it was not conquered permanently. And now the British turned toward Baltimore. Baltimore was important. It was a port city. It was home to American privateers who had been attacking British shipping. The British wanted to punish it. But Baltimore was not Washington. Baltimore was ready. The Americans built defenses. Militia gathered. The city prepared. And at the entrance to Baltimore Harbor stood Fort McHenry. If the British wanted the city, they needed to get past the fort. In September 1814, British ships bombarded Fort McHenry for about 25 hours. Rockets, bombs, explosions, all night. A lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched from a British ship. He had gone to help negotiate the release of a prisoner, but then he was stuck watching the attack. He could see the bombardment, but through the smoke and darkness, he did not know whether the fort had surrendered. Then morning came, and the American flag was still flying. Key was inspired to write a poem. That poem later became the lyrics of the Spangled Banner. So yes, the American national anthem comes from a night when everyone was basically asking, "Is the fort still there?" And the answer was, yes. very loudly. The British failed to take Baltimore, and that mattered. Washington had burned, but Baltimore held. The story changed. America had gone from humiliation to defiance. The British had shown they could strike the capital, but they had not broken American resistance. Around the same time, another major British campaign was stopped near Lake Champlain. British forces moved south from Canada. Their goal was to pressure New York and maybe gain bargaining power in peace talks. But at Plattsburgh in September 1814, American forces won an important victory. The naval battle on Lake Champlain was especially important. Without control of the lake, the British army could not safely continue, so the British withdrew. This mattered at the peace table, because Britain had sent experienced troops from the war against Napoleon, and America still stopped them. Britain was starting to ask a very reasonable question. How much do we actually want from this war? Because Britain had just spent years fighting Napoleon. It did not want an endless war in North America unless it was getting something valuable. And what was Britain getting? Expensive campaigns, angry Americans, a burned capital, a failed attack on Baltimore, problems on the lakes, and Canada still not conquered by America. Not exactly a dream vacation. Meanwhile, the United States was also tired. The war cost money. The blockade hurt trade. The government struggled financially. New England opposition grew stronger. Some Federalists were so angry that they met at the Hartford Convention. This convention became controversial because critics accused Federalists of being disloyal or even flirting with secession. The Federalists said, "We have concerns." The rest of America later said, "You had concerns at a suspicious time." The timing was terrible for them, because soon after, news arrived of peace and victory at New Orleans. The Federalists looked unpatriotic. Their party never fully recovered. So the War of 1812 helped weaken one of America's first major political parties. That is a pretty big side effect. Peace talks had already begun in Ghent in modern Belgium. The British wanted security. The Americans wanted recognition and an end to the war. Everyone wanted to stop spending money. At first, Britain made tough demands. Britain considered things like a native buffer state in the Northwest and control of parts of the Great Lakes. America said, "No thank you." As the war situation changed, Britain's demands softened. The Americans were not winning everything, but they were also not collapsing, and Britain had bigger global priorities. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, Christmas Eve, because nothing says holiday spirit like ending a war after 2.5 years of confusion. The treaty basically restored things to how they had been before the war. No major land changes, no conquered Canada, no British breakup of the United States, no dramatic new empire. Everyone just looked at the map and said, "Put it back." This is why people still ask, who won the War of 1812? And the honest answer is complicated. The United States did not conquer Canada. Britain did not break the United States. The treaty did not clearly settle all the maritime issues that helped start the war. But the Napoleonic Wars were ending, so impressment became much less important. Canada survived. The United States survived. Native resistance in the Old Northwest suffered badly, and American nationalism became stronger. So depending on where you stand, the war looks different. In Canada, it became a story of successful defense. In the United States, it became a story of survival and national pride. For many Native nations, it was a disaster. For Britain, it was a side quest during a much bigger game against Napoleon. But there was one more big event, the Battle of New Orleans. And this is where the War of 1812 becomes almost funny if you ignore all the death and suffering. Because in January 1815, British forces attacked New Orleans. New Orleans controlled the Mississippi River, so it was important. American forces were led by Andrew Jackson. Jackson was tough, aggressive, popular with his men, and not exactly the kind of person who would say, "Let us all remain calm and consider compromise." The Americans built strong defenses. They had regular soldiers, militia, free men of color, Choctaw allies, and even pirates connected to Jean Lafitte. Yes, pirates. Because sometimes history looks at a battle and says, you know what this needs? Pirates. The British attacked on January 8, 1815. The attack went terribly for them. American defenses were strong. The British advanced across open ground.
They suffered heavy casualties. The Americans won a huge victory. Andrew Jackson became a national hero. The United States celebrated. And there was one awkward detail. The Treaty of Ghent had already been signed. The war was technically on its way to being over, but news traveled slowly. There was no instant messaging, no phone call, no, "Hey guys, the war ended, please stop marching." So the most famous American victory of the war happened after the peace treaty had been signed, but before the news reached the battlefield. That is one of the most War of 1812 things ever. Fight a confusing war, sign a treaty that changes almost nothing, then have your most famous battle after the treaty is already signed. History has jokes. The Battle of New Orleans mattered anyway. Even if it did not change the treaty, it changed the mood. Americans ended the war feeling victorious. They had watched Washington burn. They had failed to conquer Canada. They had suffered blockades and defeats. But New Orleans gave them a final story that felt like triumph. And stories matter. Nations do not remember wars only by treaties. They remember flags, fires, heroes, songs, disasters, and lucky timing. The War of 1812 gave America all of those. It gave America a burned capital, Dolly Madison saving Washington's portrait, old Ironsides, the Star-Spangled Banner, Andrew Jackson at New Orleans, and the feeling that the young country had survived a second test against Britain. That is why some Americans later called it the Second War of Independence. Was that a little dramatic? Maybe, but countries love dramatic nicknames. The war also changed the future of North America. After 1815, Britain and the United States slowly moved toward a more peaceful relationship. The border with Canada became more stable. The United States turned more attention westward, and native nations lost one of their most important sources of support against American expansion. That last part is important. For the United States, the end of the war opened space for growth. For many native peoples, it opened the door to more pressure, more treaties, more land loss, and more conflict. So the war did not redraw the map much, but it changed the way people felt about the map. America felt more permanent. Canada felt more separate. Britain moved on to other imperial problems. And the old American dream of easily adding Canada faded, which was probably a relief to Canada. "Hello, Canada. Would you like to join the United States?" "No." "Are you sure? We just had a whole war about this." "Fair." The war also helped shape American politics. The Federalist Party weakened. The Democratic Republicans dominated national politics for a while. The Army and Navy gained more respect. The government learned that being unprepared for war is embarrassing, which is a lesson governments learn repeatedly and then forget in creative new ways. The United States also gained new confidence in manufacturing, because the British blockade made imported goods harder to get. So Americans had to produce more at home. This helped encourage early American industry. War is terrible for many things, but it is very good at forcing people to make their own stuff. The war also gave the country symbols, and symbols are powerful. The flag over Fort McHenry became a national image. The song became a national song. The burned buildings became proof of sacrifice. The rebuilt Capitol became proof of survival. And Andrew Jackson became proof that America could defeat a major British attack, even if the timing of that battle was deeply awkward. So why does this war matter? Because it is one of the strangest wars in American history. America declared war while Britain was busy with Napoleon. America tried to invade Canada and failed. Britain burned the American capital but failed to break the country. America won famous victories but gained no major land. The peace treaty restored the old borders, and the most famous battle happened after the treaty was signed. If this war were a school project, the teacher would write, "Interesting effort, unclear objective." But out of that confusion came a stronger American identity. The United States had been embarrassed, the capital had burned, the invasions of Canada had failed, the blockade had hurt, but the country survived. And survival can become a powerful national story. In 1812, America was still young, insecure, divided, and trying to prove it deserved respect. By 1815, it had been hit hard, set on fire, and tested. But it was still there. The War of 1812 did not make America a superpower, not yet. But it helped convince Americans that their country was not temporary. Britain could burn the president's house,
but it could not burn the United States out of existence. And that is why this messy, confusing, sometimes embarrassing war became part of America's national myth. The war began with sailors, trade, Canada, native resistance, angry politicians, and a lot of bad decisions. It ended with a burned capital, a surviving fort, a famous flag, a future president, and a country that somehow felt stronger after almost everything went wrong. So yes, the British burned Washington, but America kept going. And sometimes, in history, surviving the fire becomes the story people remember most.